as well. All right, so really quick, just so you guys will know, we're going to go ahead and get started. So our speaker today is Andrew Medhurst. He is with PLACE. So PLACE is the Program for Local Adaptation to Changing Environments. They are a Mississippi State University extension program that supports and enhances resilience to changing environments throughout the Northern Gulf. Andrew himself is a coastal resilience specialist with PLACE, and he's an extension associate with Mississippi State University. So his work mainly focuses on conducting extension and outreach activities related to the transition and translation of sea level rise information for coastal decision making. He's previously worked for multiple coastal research and stewardship programs, including the National Audubon Society in Mississippi and the United States Peace Corps in the Philippines. He has a bachelor's of science in biology and a bachelor of arts in environmental studies from Florida Gulf Coast, and he has a master's in environmental science from Florida Atlantic University. And we're very happy to have him here, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. I should be sharing my screen now, so you all should be able to see the title slide here. But thanks everyone for coming. I know that it's cold across the country right now, so it's a perfect opportunity to talk about hot weather here in January still. But regardless, hopefully this information will be useful for you all no matter what it is that you do or what type of field you're in, or whether you work for a local government or whether you work for a nonprofit organization. So as Jess said, my name is Andrew. I work for Mississippi State University Extension, and I'm also supported through our Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant Consortium. And primarily what I do is I work with coastal stakeholders on building resilience to future flooding and different types of climate conditions. A big component of resilience nowadays is utilizing the various different types of resilience tools and websites that are out there. But oftentimes it's really hard to keep up with all of the different types of tools that are available. There's a huge inflation of the amount of different types of tools that are out there. And a lot of people struggle with which ones they should be using and which ones are perfectly suited for their needs. So I'm going to be going through just a few tools today that coastal stakeholders, just like yourself, might be able to utilize for resilience planning, resilience projects, or maybe if you're working more in the outreach side of things, different types of resilience communication and outreach that you can do with your local regions. So just a few logistics before we get too far. Today, we're going to be covering 3 different online tools today. We're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on each tool, and I'll give you a brief summary of what each tool does, as well as I'll walk you through some screenshots that highlight various functions within these tools themselves. The best way for you to learn how to use these tools is to fiddle with them yourself. So if you're able to, please follow along by pulling up each of these tools as we go through them. We're going to have a few different ways that you can access these tools. I'll have a QR code, so if you wanted to follow along on your phone, these tools all work on your phone. We also are going to provide the links in the chat if you wanted to just pull up the link on your computer while you're listening to this. So I'm going to go through a few demonstrations of how each of these tools work, and I'm going to go nice and slow with the idea that you're going to be able to follow along with us and kind of click along as I'm going through these. The links to each tool is going to be copied into the chat. And as Jess said, we're also going to record this presentation, so you'll have access to re-watch this later if you wanted to go through slower at your own pace. If you have any questions about the tools, you can type them into the chat. I'll do my best to answer each of these questions, but keep in mind, I'm not the developer of each of these tools. I'm simply trying to highlight some of the tools that our federal and regional partners have created. So if you'd like more in-depth answers to some of these questions about how the tool works or where they're getting the data or how they're finding the correlations or the projections that they're getting, we can connect you with the tool developers. If you just reach out, I can make sure to get that information for you. After each tool, we're going to have a small break to answer any questions in the chat that y'all might have. So if there's a specific question you have about one of the tools that I'm going through, we'll have a break after each tool where you can ask that question. We're also going to save some time at the end of the presentation to make sure we have a little bit more time to answer any questions y'all might have. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll also have a brief survey. If you're able to fill that out, it really helps us out a lot. I'm somebody that's always looking to try and improve, whether it's my personal life or my professional life. I love getting this type of input to know how we can improve things. So if you have ideas about how we can give this presentation better, how we can incorporate different types of tools, or even if you have other ideas for different types of topics that we could potentially talk about in the future, I'd love to get any insight that you have. Like I said, I'm always trying to make these things better. So any information that you can give us on how we can do our jobs better is very, very useful for me. I take that stuff very seriously. So don't feel like you have to hold back. All right. And with that, kind of talk about a little bit of what I do so you can get a sense of why I'm the one talking about this stuff today and how it is that I use this information. So first of all, like I mentioned before, my name's Andrew. I work for a program called PLACE, which is a really long acronym that I don't like to describe often, but just for the first time here, it's the Program for Local Adaptation to Changing Environments. We understand that all throughout the United States right now, conditions are changing. A lot of times it might be climate conditions, sometimes it might be developmental conditions. And what our program does is we really focus on how we're able to adapt to those changing environments and changing conditions and how we can support our coastal decision makers, residents, and anyone else living in these regions to make sure that they can become more resilient to these changing conditions. Our overarching mission is to increase community resilience to changing conditions and make sure that communities understand the associated risks and the various types of hazards and impacts that they're facing in these areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we're supported through both Mississippi State University Extension and Sea Grant through Mississippi and Alabama. But my program works throughout the entire Gulf region. I do work all across the entire state of Florida, as well as the other 4 Gulf states. I'm originally from Southwest Florida, so I have a lot of experience working in Florida and dealing with a lot of the things that y'all are dealing with in Florida right now. So when I was invited to actually give this presentation for a Florida specific heat tools training, I was very excited because, like I said, I've lived in Florida for a very long time. Florida, I'm still consider myself a Floridian at heart. So my job primarily revolves around 3 main components. And I'm guessing a lot of your jobs probably revolve around either one of these 3 or multiple of these components as well. The first thing I do is I need to understand risk. We work with researchers, federal partners, and universities to make sure we're getting the most up-to-date science so that we can use that for ourselves. It's not just enough, though, to understand what's happening. We want to be able to communicate that risk. So we then digest that information and package it in different ways so that we can communicate with various different coastal decision makers, whether it's teachers, whether it's municipal officials, elected officials, residents, real estate agents. Depending on our audience, we communicate this information in different ways. So today I'm going to talk to you all like you have a little bit of background information about these types of things. I know that we have some people probably from local cities, counties. We probably have some people from nonprofit organizations, pretty good spread of people that kind of have an idea about what's happening. And hopefully these tools will enable you to communicate some of these things a little bit better with your audiences. But as we all know, it's not enough to just understand and then communicate. We need action. So one of the legs of what we do is we actually will facilitate action. We leverage our network of stakeholders and resources throughout the entire Gulf region to help plan projects, write planning documents, and conduct events that can help to address these types of risks. So most of you probably focus on one or more of these types of topics, and today's webinar ideally will help you utilize these tools to address these specific types of topics, whether you're looking to understand your organization's specific risks and communicate that to larger audiences, or if you're looking to design projects that will actually develop a plan or some type of way to address these risks. So a huge part of my job is sifting through all of the different types of tools and information that exist on the internet. And in the last 10 years, there's been a huge growth of the amount of different types of tools that are out there. If you've ever tried Google searching for resilience tools, you'll find that there's a lot of tools. Some of them are designed for different types of coastal professionals. They have different functions. They have different outputs. Some have different data, depending on what it is that you're looking for. So the big question is, which tool should I be using? So that's the whole point of this webinar today, is we're going to specifically focus in on tools to address heat. And I'm going to focus in on 3 specific tools that we've really leveraged in the past. I've worked extensively with these types of tools, and we've used them for all different types of stakeholders, different audiences, and different planning and grant applications that we've done. So those 3 tools that we're going to go through today, the first one is the National Weather Service's HeatRisk tool. The second one is the CDC's Heat and Health Tracker. And then the last one is the NOAA Climate Explorer. So some of you may be familiar with these tools. If you have used them before, hopefully you can learn something new about how you can leverage these tools to do your job. But if you haven't heard about any of these tools, then that's perfect. That's exactly what this webinar was designed for, to kind of showcase these tools, some of the features that they have, and then give a short demonstration on how some of these functions work. I've also included a couple real world case study examples on how these tools can be applied to actual scenarios specific to Florida. I focused on kind of the Southwest Florida region for these tools to give you an idea about some of the day-to-day operations and scenarios that you may be faced with that these tools could actually be utilized for. So without further ado, we're going to move into our first tool, which is the National Weather Service's HeatRisk tool. So Jess is going to provide a link in the chat. Perfect. So you can access that if you're on your computer. You can follow that link. It'll take you to the main page for this tool. If you're on your phone, you can scan this QR code right there on the right side of the screen, and it'll bring up the mobile version of the tool for you. So think of this tool as, do we need to act this week? I'm going to kind of frame some of these tools on how it is that you're specifically trying to think about how you're going to leverage it as your day-to-day job. But this is a brand new tool that's still in development phase, so got to be patient with it. It's not quite finished yet, but it's close enough that we can still leverage a lot of these features and functions to assess short-term heat-related forecasts. So this tool works by combining weather and climate and health data to identify dangerous heat levels that could be detrimental to human health. Think of it like a weather app on your phone. What it's going to do is it's going to give you a 7-day outlook or forecast that ranges the projected heat risk on a 5-tiered scale, ranging from no risk to extreme risk. So picture like you're pulling up your weather app. This one is a weather app that's essentially specifically to look at heat risk in your area, and it shows you associated risks that are affiliated with a different level of heat that you're in right now. So right now, because we just had a huge cold front come through, most of the country faces no heat risk. But I pulled a lot of these images from this past summer, so you can see what some of these heat images look like in the summer, because being Floridians, you all know how hot it gets during the summer months. Even this time of the year, I guess yesterday y'all had some record level heat for this time of the year. It's not necessarily the type of heat that we're looking at when we're talking about high levels of heat risk, but nonetheless, you can use this all times of the year to look at different levels of heat. But some of these screenshots you're going to see are from different areas of the country or from past months in Florida when we actually did have some variation in our heat risk. So first thing I'd like to talk about is who should be using these tools. A lot of times we get people in these webinars and they see these types of tools and like, oh, I don't know if that one's actually something that I should be using or if maybe one of my work partners should be using. So just to kind of clear it up, if you work for a city or a county, you can use this tool to coordinate with EMS, public communications teams, and city and county resources when you know that you're going to be expecting hot days. Coordinating on a shared threshold, like coordinating on a day that has a level 4 extreme heat risk, you might have some type of planned agreement in place that says when we reach this level 4 threshold, no matter what, we're opening all of the cooling centers and deploying our emergency management services to the local beaches and parks. And then we'll also trigger our public communication team to post social media warnings to make sure residents are aware of the heat risk on these specific days. So let's say, that you're with the city or the county, but let's say you're a researcher. I know we have some people affiliated with universities in here today, but let's say you conduct a lot of field work outside during the hot summer months. Let's say you want to conduct some field work in a specific week that you know is going to be really, really hot. You can look at the 7-day forecast and decide which days actually have the lowest heat risk. And then you can decide to go out on some of those days and then maybe save some of the indoor activities that you have for the days where there's going to be a particularly high heat risk. And then let's say you work in outreach and engagement. I know we have some people that work in communications and public communications in here. The summer is a really popular time for weekend events and outdoor activities. So it's really nice to be able to look ahead, let's say like on a Monday or a Tuesday, and look at this coming weekend to make sure that you can see what the heat risk is going to be on a day that you have an event scheduled. So depending on the severity of that heat risk, you can plan accordingly and make sure to become prepared with things like water bottles, fans, or even something like having EMS on standby for an event in which you know for a fact that there's going to be increased temperatures. You don't want to be caught off guard with things like this because, as you know, heat is one of the most dangerous climate conditions that the United States faces. It affects more Americans than anything else. So high levels of heat are something we really, really need to be paying attention to. And this tool is perfect to make sure you can get a short-term outlook as what's to come. So how does it work? What it's doing is it's not using heat index and it's not using wet bulb globe temperature. Some of you may be familiar that a lot of the heat tools we have out there will use one of these two forms in order to communicate heat risk. But the problem is there's not enough stations across the country that will measure hourly humidity. So heat index, it fluctuates a lot. It's really difficult to measure. Heat index also does not account for the excessive warm nights like this tool does. One of the things that we're seeing as we go on in time is we're getting hotter and hotter days, but also our nights are not cooling down. And a lot of these metrics that we've used in the past do not account for some of the excessive warm nights that we've had, like this tool will. So what this tool is actually using is it's comparing daily highs and lows and comparing that to historical averages for that exact time period. So then what it's going to do is the top 5% of temperatures are used as a threshold, and then all of these temperatures are classified according to the CDC's heat and health data that determines the risk to actual human health. So I mentioned before about the humidity. While the tool doesn't directly measure humidity, it's using temperature and dew point relationships to approximate humidity levels. So that is something that is still taken into account because I know that it's very different depending on whether you're in Arizona or whether you're in South Florida when it comes to humidity, because humidity can really amplify some of the heat effects that we see in some of our local regions. So this tool is taking into account humidity. It's just in a slightly different way. So now I'm going to start walking through this tool. So if you have it pulled up, this is the time now you can kind of click through this with me. So when you pull it up, you'll see a big color-coded map that has the current day's heat risk. You can click and drag around and pan around this map and zoom into a specific region if you're curious about it. In the top left corner of the map, you can see the plus and minus button. That allows you to zoom in really closely on some areas. Like I said, right now we've had a cold front pass through most of the country. So most of your map right now is going to look like it's got a heat risk 0, little to no heat. And that's because it's the winter. We're not going to really have a lot of really high temperatures. But look at this tool in June and July, and you're going to see a very different looking map. So this is just a picture of this tool from the last time we did this presentation in September. And you can see Florida is one of those states that like to hang on to its heat longer than others. So you can see different areas in Florida and how it's holding on to that heat and how heat risk is higher in some of our urban areas. And as you move up along the southeast coast, you can see the same thing following suit with Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and even up into Virginia. So I mentioned you can drag and zoom around the map. What you can also do, like here's a zoomed in version of Florida. So let's say I zoom in on Florida. You can see there's pockets like around Orlando where we really get that urban heat effect, where we're seeing high pockets of major heat risk. So what this tool does is it has very, very high resolution. As you start zooming in, it really lets you look closely into specific regions within your overall region. They're going to show you which areas you really need to be looking out for. What you can also do if you don't want to click and drag around, you can just straight up type a location into the search bar, the top left corner there. This lets you type in a specific address if you want to find your exact building location or if you have an address of your house that you want to look at. But you can also just type in cities or counties and it will zoom in to the map based off of what you type in. So what you can do, for example, so I work in Mississippi. I work on the coast here in Biloxi. So if I wanted to type in, for example, Mississippi State University Coastal Research Center, I can type that in the search bar and it's going to zoom in just like you see here. And it's going to actually show you a very, very local image of what I'm seeing with the heat on our local region. On the bottom left here, you can see that there's a key with different types of colors. That corresponds to the heat risk at the given time. So right now, most of the country probably looks like that light green shaded color. There's little to no expected heat risk right now because it's so cold out. But you'll see that there's yellow, orange, red, and then it gets into magenta. The darker it gets, that means the higher the level of heat it's going to get. So if you look at this tool a few months from now, you'll probably see more of these yellow, orange, and red and purple areas. the darker it gets, the hotter it is and the higher the heat risk. So right now there's not a ton of it, but trust me, as time goes on, you'll see more and more deviations from these color-coded areas. And then at the top left here, you'll see that there's a 7-day forecast. Starting with today's date, you can click into each of those days and see the heat risk going up to about 7 days out. So it'll show you variations in the map and then also give you associated heat risks for those days. So like I said earlier, let's say it's like a Thursday and you want to look at the weekend because you have some events planned. You can click into Saturday and Sunday and actually see the heat risk and look at the map to see where it's going to be the highest. And if you coincidentally have an event that you're hosting at a beach that has a high level of heat risk, you know, maybe you should come a little bit more prepared than you normally would if it was a day with a lower heat risk. So I want to go over the color coding really quickly. The colors that you see are on a scale from 0 to 4. So there's 5 different color codes. As the scales darken, the risk is increasing. So the higher the risk, that means the higher the risk to human health. That's what we're talking about mainly here, is human health. Each category on the scale is associated with various different types of health effects and recommendations on how to prepare for these conditions. If you actually click into the tool here, it'll actually tell you what the heat risks are at various different heat risk levels. So you can see what you should be expected at like a major heat risk compared to a minor heat risk. Something to keep in mind too is that heat risk affects everyone differently. For example, children and the elderly are much more sensitive to heat risk, so it's important to make sure you understand the sensitivity of different demographics that you're working with and different types of groups within your region. And coincidentally, the next tool I'm going to show you will actually let you dive into those demographics and then align that with some of these heat risks. So keep that in mind. Heat affects everyone differently. What you or I might think is hot is completely different for somebody like, you know, in the elderly community or somebody in an underserved community. So I want to talk about a hypothetical case study. Let's say, you know, you're wanting to find examples of how we can use this tool in your day-to-day operations. So let's say that you work for Collier County and you're preparing for a hot Memorial Day weekend. The county knows for sure that tourists and residents are going to be wanting to visit the county's beaches and parks, and they want to be prepared for higher heat risk to make sure that they can accommodate these visitors. So what the city does is they decide to use the National Weather Service's heat risk tool to look at a 7-day forecast ahead of the weekend to see just what to expect for heat risk and what types of preparations or services that they should plan ahead for. So here's an example. This is Florida in June from last year, so you can get an idea about where the different areas of heat risk are. And you can see there are some areas that are going to be higher heat risk than others. And there's pockets there where we actually have major heat risk even. So the event organizers, what they can do is they can look up that 7-day forecast and they can see Memorial Day weekend and that they're expecting maybe in some areas a moderate heat risk, which is higher than they have been expecting over the last few days. So what the county can do is they can decide to provide additional resources. They can open cooling stations. They can make sure to provide different things like water or temporary shade for attendees at the beach or the parks. And they can also do things like ensure that emergency health services are on standby to make sure that everyone's healthy and then everyone's taken care of on the weekend, since heat risk could pose a major health risk for those that are outdoors. And with a holiday weekend, you know, there's going to be a lot of people that are probably not paying a whole lot of attention to things like how hot it's going to be outside. So if you're working for a county or you're working for a city, it's really important that you make sure you stay on top of these things and prepare, because you know that a lot of your tourists and residents are not going to be doing that. Let's say, here's another hypothetical situation. I know we have some people that do field work out here. Let's say you're organizing field work and you have a 5-day window to conduct just 1 day of field work during the week, but you have some flexibility to decide what day you actually go out. So almost think of it like looking at the rain forecast for the week. If you're working on a boat, you know, to avoid the days where it's going to be the rainiest, then maybe just look for those days where the rain conditions are going to be a little bit more tolerable. We can do the exact same thing for heat. It sounds very, very simple, but you'd be surprised how many people get caught out working in extremely hot conditions that are putting themselves and their coworkers at risk. Whereas if they would have just looked at a 7-day forecast, they probably could have aligned these research days or these fieldwork days on days where there's going to be lower heat risk. So let's say, like I said, for example, you're working for the university, you want to coordinate a research day or project day where you can go out and do some field work. And you know that you need to do at least one day of field work this week. You want to know which days have the lowest heat risk so you can make sure that you're keeping your fieldwork team safe and you're not putting them out there on the hottest day of the week. So once again, we can look at different days. As you click through the different forecasts for the 7-day forecast, you can see that there is a very clear distinction between one day to the next. And from here, you can see that Wednesday has a lower heat risk than any other days that occurred on that week. So even just the previous day, look how different the heat risk is going from Tuesday in May to the very next day on Wednesday, that same calendar week. So you can see heat risk changes quickly. It's not something that's going to be stagnant throughout the entire week. Sometimes it's night and day from one day to the next. So paying attention to this throughout the week allows you to kind of accommodate these conditions. And based on your availability, you can schedule field work accordingly and make sure that you're preparing for these either very, very hot days, or maybe you have a lull in those hot days and you want to make sure you get your team out there to do as much field work as possible. So I'm going to take a pause for a few minutes here. If anyone has questions specifically about the National Weather Service's heat risk tool, I can do my best to address those tools right now.
So we do have a couple of questions that have popped up. I'll ask one, is there a way to put different dates, or is it just for the next 7 days?
It's only for the next 7 days, unfortunately. They don't want to provide information too far out because people tend to hang on this information like it's factual. But remember, these are just our best estimates and projections. So a week out is about the best we can do with these projections. It's like trying to look up the weather forecast, in June. You're not going to, they can give you an idea, but it's not going to really be anything you can base decisions off of. So unfortunately, a week is all we have right now.
Okay. And then somewhat related to that one is, does it let you see,
Oh,
so
earlier days?
earlier dates, and then does it let you see past or historical dates?
Unfortunately, that is not something they've incorporated, but I have talked to the tool developer to see if we can access past days, because it is something that would be useful to see what times of the month you're getting the hottest days. So as of right now, that is not something they've incorporated, but I have been communicating with the developer of the tool to give them insight on what they can provide for the future. And that's one of the biggest things that I've asked for, is being able to access future dates and time. The next tool that I'm going to show you does enable you to look back at previous days. But this one for now, it's only the next 7 days. Yep.
Yeah.
And then so I just saw the question about it only showing green. The only reason it's showing green right now is because it's showing you, what is today, the 27th. It's showing you today through, what is that, like February 2nd or something. So those are all going to be cold days. So they're all going to show green because there's no heat risk associated with that the next coming week. Definitely a tool that serves more purpose during the hot summer months. This time of the year, it's harder to really see what's happening because the heat risk is pretty, universal across the board. But once summer months hit, this is where this tool really comes in handy, because you can start to see the variation on each day.
Okay. And then we have one final question asking if you know how the heat risk is calculated. Do you know the equation that they used for that?
I don't have the exact equation, but it is coordinated with the CDC's heat risk calculations. So what it's doing is it's taking account of the top 5% of hot days and then aligning that with the CDC's recommendations for heat or extreme heat. So I don't recall them off the top of my head, but it is aligning it with CDC data. So it is using federal data to provide the heat risk. I can probably provide more information on that if I have a second later towards the end of the presentation. I have it somewhere, but off the top of my head, I don't have the exact equation that they're using.
Yeah, we can also include that in a follow-up email.
Perfect.
And then somebody asked, it doesn't apply as much to us on this call, but is there a comparable tool for cold weather risk for human health?
I don't know off the top of my head, but that is something I thought about as I was making this presentation, because I'm in Mississippi right now. It's really cold here. So this type of information is not super applicable. But I was wanting to see if there was something that would warn about cold risk as well. So that's, once again, it's something I can check in on and give you guys more ideas. But being in the South, cold is not something we deal with too often, so it's not something I'm very familiar with. We're definitely more used to dealing with extreme heat. But that is a great question.
All right. And does anybody else have any other questions? You can either pop it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, or if you're feeling very brave, you can raise your hand as well.
I'll go ahead and move on to the next to make sure we're staying on time.
Mhm.
So this one goes a little bit deeper. That first tool I showed you, kind of limited. It only shows you like a 7-day forecast of heat. So can't really look at like long-term projections or any types of past projections. So this tool is really starting to incorporate longer timelines and also starting to look at some of that demographic data that I had mentioned earlier, because we know that some people are more at risk than others. So this is the CDC's Heat and Health Tracker. The URL is right up there, and I think Jess should provide the chat, the link in the chat. Perfect. So this tool, we're looking at basically how does heat affect the risk to human health, but we're going to be using census data to actually dive into specific areas within your region to see how it's affecting different demographics. So with this tool, you can think of it as who is being impacted right now. What it's doing is it's providing county level heat illness data displayed in almost real time. So what they're doing is they're digesting all of the information from hospitals and local clinics about actual heat related illnesses that are happening as they provide it. And then what it's going to do is it's going to pull in census tract data and overlay that demographic data on top of some of the heat risk that's being impacted right now to show you which areas are going to be the most vulnerable to those heat conditions. This tool also provides some nice population characteristics so that you can compare those to the national median to see if your areas maybe have more than average, vulnerable populations that should be thinking about these types of things. How does it work? Since this is looking at emergency room visits and local clinic visits associated with heat-related illnesses. So this is taking into account of all sorts of different things, but mostly we're looking at heat illness hospital visits and local clinic visits. This is in very close to real time. It's probably about as recent as yesterday. So you can actually see some trends that are happening here in very close to real time. And what it's doing is it's extrapolating that out over 100,000 emergency room visits. And I mentioned before, it's pulling in census tract data to look at different types of population characteristics. So depending on where it is that you're looking at, you'll see different statistics here across the bottom. You can look at the very bottom. There's an age breakdown there to see how old is the people that you're looking at in your census tract. Keep in mind, if you're working in an area like in South Florida, you're going to have a higher population of elderly. So the elderly have a higher risk to heat. So it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about how is heat going to affect your specific region. Think about like how many elderly do we have? How many children do we have in our region? And then you can also look at things like the amount of population that doesn't have health insurance, the amount of population that's living in poverty. Unfortunately, the percentage of population that is a minority, that part of the census tool is offline right now because of some of the changes to the federal data. So if you try and pull up the tool right now, you'll just see like a loading bar on that blue icon there. But you can still access a lot of the other census level data about demographics for each of these regions that we're looking at. So here's how it works. If you want to pull it up yourself, you can start clicking along with me right now. When you open the tool, the first thing you'll see is that there's a big map displaying the current day's information. It's color coded based on the heat related illnesses ranging from none to extreme. So this is just like the previous tool that I showed you. It's using the exact same scale. So you're going to see right now, probably a map that looks entirely green because there's not a lot of hot places in the United States right now. But once again, look at this map in a few months and it's going to be very, very different. One of the cool things you can actually do with this map though, is you can see just below the red arrow there, a little bit to the right, there's a thing that says choose a date. You can actually look at past days for this tool. So there was a question about the last tool about looking at past data. You can actually use this tool to go back in time and actually look at some of this data from past years. The real functionality though of this tool is being able to search by your own county or even your own zip code. And you can see that orange bar across the top there. all you got to do is type in a zip code or your county, and it'll actually zoom in and give you specific data and demographic information and census data for that specific zip code or county, depending on what you put in. Remember, this tool is using the same, it's incorporating some of the things we looked at from that past tool. So here's, for example, what a lot of you saw right now for heat risk, little to none every single day of the week. So it's just going to look green across the board. This tool, for whatever reason, has decided not to incorporate that map that the previous tool uses, but you can still access a lot of the same information on this tool. But this one kind of goes above and beyond to dive in a little bit deeper in some specific categories. So if you scroll down on the page a little bit, you'll see a little bit more information. This is what your map might look like, for example. So zooming in on South Florida, you can see the first thing that I pointed out here is the ability to access this drop-down menu for points of interest. Depending on what it is that you're looking at, you can adjust the points of interest to look at things like hospitals, schools, or even parks. So you can align that with what it is that you're looking to do. So let's say you're looking at health information. You want to look at things like hospitals to make sure that the hospitals are aligned with areas where you know there's the greatest risk. Or let's say you wanted to look at something like planning a public event at the beach on the weekend. You can look for things like parks, and that's going to include some of your public beaches so that you can see which beaches are going to have the highest level of heat risk for the demographics that exist in those areas. So you can know to plan accordingly for those certain areas. The legend on the left there is showing you the scale of heat risk. You can actually toggle these on and off to focus in on different areas that are higher at risk. And then lastly, on the bottom, I mentioned before, you can see different types of population characteristics of the county or of the zip code that you've actually typed in. So you can see some of the demographics and why they may be more prone to increased heat risk. And then something that I didn't point out here with arrows or anything, but above the map on the top left, you can see where the points of interest is. To the left of that, you can see there's the heat health index layers. That's also something that you can use a drop-down menu to toggle between different types of filters. It's going to allow you to look at different things like the overall heat and health index rank, which is what I primarily use. But there's also different types of maps that you can look at color-coded for things like infrastructure and different types of like urban planning and natural resource development. So depending on what it is you're looking for, you can toggle between those. But for most part, if you're looking at things like human health and planning accordingly, I leave it on the overall heat and health index rank here. All right, so let's go through some quick hypothetical case studies. Let's say you're working for the city of Naples, and you're responsible for deciding when to open up the cooling centers on really, really hot days. What you can do is you can monitor temperatures for the upcoming week and use that 7-day forecast, just like the one we used previously. And you can see what days there's a need to open the shelters. But then the big question is, where should we be opening our shelters? We know we can't open every single one of them because we don't have enough staff to really support all of these. So are there specific shelters or are there specific regions where we know we should be providing resources to areas because we know that they have different types of community demographics that puts them more at risk? So that's where this tool really comes in handy. So using the CDC's Heat and Health Tool Tracker, the city can look at individual census tracts and find out which areas have the greatest risk from heat. And then you can also toggle between different types of interest, points of interest to see different types of infrastructure, different types of buildings located within these risk areas to see where it is that we should be focusing resources. So let's say, for example, here on the screen, you can see that I've toggled on parks as a point of interest. So that's all of the parks, and then it also includes a lot of the public beaches. So we know if some of these beaches or parks fall into some of these darker areas, we know that we should probably allocate more resources to those areas because we know that they're going to be at a greater risk from heat because of their population demographics and some of the characteristics that we've seen in the census data. And remember, you don't have to just look at parks or hospitals. There's all sorts of different points of interest you can toggle between. So depending on what field you work in or what your job specifically is looking to do, you can prioritize different types of resources, different types of staff support, and different types of infrastructure that you're looking to accommodate. So let's think of another hypothetical scenario here that's probably very real for a lot of areas, especially for y'all in Florida. Collier County health officials have noticed a big spike in the number of health-related emergency room visits during the recent heat wave. So remember, this tool is taking in emergency room visits that are associated with heat illnesses. So if you're paying attention to this tool, you notice there's a recent spike over the last few days. You know that you need to do something differently to prepare. So what you want to do is look at some of the areas that are receiving the highest risk and make sure that you can provide staff assistance and resources to the areas that are going to be most affected. So you pull up this map, and then what we want to look at this time is hospitals. So you can see within Collier County, we only have 4 hospitals, but you can see some of them are falling into areas of low heat risk because of census data, and some of them fall into areas that have a slightly higher heat risk because of some of the demographic information that we have there. So you can know that in areas of higher risk, we can designate more resources and to make sure that they're ready for a prepared increase in the different types of heat-related illnesses that they're going to see in those areas. So that might look like designating more staff to different types of hospitals and different types of emergency response centers to prepare for heat risk. It might also be something just like allocating different types of resources like water bottles and mobile cooling stations that we have during some of these heat events to make sure that in some of these areas where they can't get to a hospital easily or areas that are too far from a hospital, they can actually provide resources for those. And so now our health officials can actually prioritize assisting areas that have the highest risk and looking at where some of these very, very important resources can be allocated most appropriately. All right, so once again, we'll take a few minutes for questions. If anyone has questions specifically about this tool and how you can incorporate that into your day-to-day operations or use it for future planning, now is the time.
Don't see any in the chat as of yet, and I don't have any in the Q&A, but we can give it a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I'll give it a few seconds here and then move on since we're getting close to the end here. And I want to make sure we cover this last tool because that's probably the one that's most applicable to y'all. Oh, got a hand raised.
Rachel has her hand raised. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I raised my hand just because it's going to be probably an easier question to communicate verbally. And it might be a little oddly specific, but when I'm looking at the different categories they have, because they have it by age, and even by like sensitivity based on pre-existing medical conditions, especially in Florida, do they take humidity into account at all for that, or is it strictly based off of just heat itself? Because I know, like looking at asthma, that's humidity is for myself at least more of a trigger than the heat itself.
Yes, it is taking into account humidity. So it's using that same type of calculation that I showed before, where it's not taking wet bulb temperature specifically, but it's using a calculation that they've used from past data to incorporate humidity into these calculations. And that's what the CDC is using.
Great, thank you so much.
No problem. All right, I'm going to jump into the next tool here. Since it's got about 10 minutes left, so I'll go kind of quick for this one. But this one, like I said, this is the one that I use most often and the one that I think a lot of you will probably find most interesting. This one is called NOAA's Climate Explorer. So this tool is developed by a large team of federal partners, and it's one of the tools that you'll see used most often in different types of planning and grant writing applications. So what this can do is it provides very finely detailed heat, cold, and precipitation data for both historical trends and future projections. So you can look at the past and look at what's been happening and then extrapolate that data out and look at future projections to see how we should be preparing for the future. So this is primarily used to support things like grant applications, especially if you're doing any types of federal grant applications. They love seeing things like this. It's used for updating planning documents, like if you have capital improvement plans, CCMPs, other types of resilience and mitigation planning. It also provides really good guidelines and justification for future capital investments. So if you're working at the city or the county level and you really want to emphasize, the need for investments in things like shade structures or updated air conditioning and HVAC systems or installing cooling structures, this is a really good tool that can provide you actual hard data to show why that's necessary. So some of the features of this tool, like I said, historical and future projected heat and cold data. something I'm not going to talk about too much today, but it also provides precipitation data. That's a big part of my job, is telling people how much it rains. I don't know if y'all notice, it rains a lot nowadays. It didn't used to rain this much. We get a lot more extreme rainfall events. So this tool also provides information about overall rainfall of the course of the year, but also extreme rainfall events. But today we're going to look at heat, but also a little bit of cold data. So we're mostly looking at the heat and cold side of things, but this tool does more than just the heat and cold. And what it does is it pumps out maps and graphs that allow you to visualize county level data so that you can utilize that in different types of planning documents, public communication, grant applications, or like, let's say you're doing presentations to your local board. You can give them some, visualizations of what we're looking at for the future, because sometimes this stuff is difficult to grasp. It's hard to communicate just how many hot days we're going to get over the course of a year and just how much temperatures have increased over the last 30 years. So things like this are really, really useful for that. So how does it work? It's pulling data from weather stations dating all the way back to 1950, and it's projecting out future conditions using climate models that account for both the low and high emission scenarios that we're looking at. So you can see, based off this image here to the left, the gray area on the left side of the screen, that's the past. That's what we're looking at, historical conditions there and the range of temperatures that we've seen. So for this one, I've decided to look at the average daily maximum temperature. That shaded gray area is what's happening over average amount of time. And then individually, you can see each year has got one of those dark gray bars. What that's showing is, on a specific year, is there an above average or a below average daily temperature? So you can see sometimes that dark gray bar is above the average line, and sometimes it's below the average line. What that's doing is it's showing you this year, their averages were higher than normal, or this year, the averages were lower than normal. And then when you look to the right side of the screen, you see there's red and blue overlaid with each other. This is showing the same thing, but looking out into the future. Red is representing a future high emission scenario, and the blue is projecting a low emission scenario. So depending on what our emissions look like in the future, or where you're trying to make your own projections, you can look at both of these projections and kind of compare them. But either way, you can see that moving forward, the average temperatures that we're seeing are increasing. And you can see just how quickly they increase over time, and you can see some of the variation over years. So it's not something that's just going to be steady over time. It fluctuates. Nature wiggles. So there's a little bit of variation year to year. But the big thing we're looking at is trends. As we go out in time, we're seeing higher temperatures going forward. And it's using global climate models. So they're actually looking at projected future changes, and we're using these two different climate models that look at low emission scenarios, which is like a best case scenario, or the high emission scenarios, which is kind of just like business as usual. So if you have it pulled open, I'll show you how to use it right now. There's a big search bar across the top. This is a pretty simple to use website, honestly. I think it's very intuitive, but first thing you're going to do, search by a city or a county. I like ones that allow you to search by city because it actually can provide some very fine details. But if you want to look at the county level too, it also does that. So you can type it into the search bar there. And then once you click search, you'll see a screen like this. It divides it into 5 different sections there with maps, graphs, flooding, historical weather data, historical thresholds. We're primarily going to be looking at the climate graphs and tables for this. So to actually use the tool, what we're going to do is across the top there, you can see there's a drop-down menu that lets you look at various different types of climate information, temperatures, extreme heat and cold days, precipitation data. There's probably about 20 or 30 different options you can filter through there. And then you can also click on some of these blue buttons down here on the bottom. If you want to clean up your graph a little bit, you can toggle those on and off and remove them from the graph. So you can actually kind of, let's say you don't want to look at the past, you just want to look at the future, or let's say you only want to look at a certain date range, or you want to look at just the low emission scenarios. You can toggle these to give it exactly what you want. And then if you click inside of the graph there and then click and drag, you can actually adjust the time frame that you're looking at. So let's say you're only interested in from 2000 to 2050. If you click right about the 2000 there and then click and drag over to 2050, it'll zoom in on that exact time frame there, so you can get a more specifically focused time frame. And then the really meat and potatoes of this tool, you can see across the top there, the download section. If you click downloads there, you'll get the option to download these graphs in various different formats. So depending on what it is you're looking for, it gives JPEGs, it gives PDFs, it gives I can't even remember the other types of data. There's a lot of different ways you can download this information and then incorporate that into different types of planning documents, grant applications, presentations. No matter what it is that you're doing, graphs like this are incredibly helpful to paint a picture of what's happening. Because remember, pictures say 1,000 words. It would take me a lot of words to describe how heat is changing going forward, but providing a graph like this really gives you a really succinct way to provide that information. So real quickly before we end here, some hypothetical case study scenarios. Let's say you're working for Collier County and you've been tasked with providing shade structures throughout the county to reduce heat or to reduce risk from heat during the summer months. The county knows that they have a need for these types of things, but you specifically want to show justification for why these shade structures are so important. So what you can do is you can pull historical trends and you can put future projections onto that same map and then actually provide this information to your grant administrator so that they can include this type of information to justify a project that will actually fund different types of shade structures. And you can incorporate that information to really prove a point about just how important these structures are if you look at future conditions. So here's like an example of what that would look like. As you can see going forward, we're going to get more and more days with max temperatures above a certain threshold, and that's only going to increase. And compared to historical averages, we've been steadily increasing over time. And even when we look at things like the amount of hot days, we're also increasing with that. So depending on how it is you want to prove your point, you can look at different types of filters and then limit this data to really show you trends of what's happening. And then the grant administrator can download each of these graphs as a PNG or a JPEG and include them in different types of grant proposals to then justify the need for the project. Remember, you can toggle on and off different features and zoom in and out of different date ranges to help justify. Another example, let's say the city of Naples wants to write a grant to replace all of their air conditioning units. Let's say they have outdated air conditioning units that are struggling to keep up with the extreme temperatures that we're getting nowadays. So the city knows that these things need to be updated, but you as the grant administrator for the city of Naples, you want to be able to prove a point about just how much you need these air conditioning units and why the city should be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into something like that. So what you can do is look at future projections and show just how quickly we're going to be seeing these increases in hot days and hot temperatures. So if you pull up the graph, you can see the number of days per year above 100 degrees Fahrenheit is going to increase over time. Maybe not so much at first, but by 2050, 2060, that's when we really start seeing a pretty big increase in the amount of days above 100 degrees or 95 degrees that were expected. And then you can look at things like the number of days above 90 degrees to kind of get an idea about what's the best way to visualize the need for updating all of these HVAC systems. So the city can then look at this and say, yep, we know that we're going to get more hot days in the future, so we know that it's worth it to invest $300,000 to update our HVAC units. And then a last one here, just because it's so cold out lately. South Florida, y'all don't get cold ever. But let's say you work for the city of Pensacola, and there's a few instances of them having freezing temperatures over the last couple of years. And the city has a budget to keep open warming centers, but they only have a budget to, open so many for a certain number of days over the year because they have limited staff and limited capacity. So they want to know, looking trends going forward, what should we prepare for? Do we need to allocate more money to open these warming shelters? Are we expected more days of cold weather, or are we expected less days of them? So they want to look at future projections to see what the cold looks like in the future. So they'll pull up a graph that looks like this with the number of days each year that you get below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And they are reaffirmed that on average from 1960 to 2000, they've had about 25 days on average per year below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But as they move forward in time, you're going to actually see that average decrease. By 2050, we're looking at probably only about 15 days per year where we're going to see those temperatures dip that low. But it allows them to kind of prepare for the future and think ahead about what it is that they need to be preparing for. So you can see, like I said, we only had about 25 cold days on average from that time period, but going forward, you can see that that number is much lower. But that's still, you can look at like 2010 there, you can see there's a black bar that's above the rest there. Some years we get really cold years, and that year in 2010, we had 43 cold days above the average. So some years still can be particularly cold. So graphs like this are really helpful to kind of illustrate just how important these necessary improvements and planning are for cities and counties. So at that point, if anyone has any questions about this tool, Climate Explorer, or if you have questions for any of the other tools, go ahead and put up the final slide here. Ask away. If you have questions too that you want to ask me personally, my email address is down there. Feel free to shoot me an email. I can help provide one-on-one demonstrations with these tools or technical information. If you need assistance with how to incorporate this into a specific project, I'm also able to do that. Or if you just want to chat, or if you'd like me to give a presentation like this to your organization or to your community or to a different type of audience that you're looking to communicate with, I'd also be happy to help with that type of thing going forward too. So one last thing I do want to mention is the surveys. Like I said, we're always looking to improve these presentations. So we're going to put that survey in there if y'all have the time to provide those surveys and give us any useful information that I can use going forward. We would love that.
Yeah, I do want to say I'm actually gonna really quickly take back over. Thank you again so much, Andrew, for coming and talking with us. We really super appreciate it.